The chamber could hold 10,000 delegates, and on most days, it felt like it needed every seat. Today, it did not. Velerin had noticed that first. Not the empty chairs themselves, those came and went depending on trade cycles, border tensions, seasonal migrations. No, what he noticed was the pattern of the emptiness. Entire clusters of seats unoccupied in sections that were usually filled by species known for their punctuality, their procedural obsession, their refusal to miss even the most trivial session. That was unusual. Velerin had been sitting in this chamber for longer than most species had been members of the council. Long enough that the architecture felt less like a structure and more like a memory he had learned to walk through. He knew the way sound carried differently depending on where you stood. He knew which lights flickered half a second before dimming for recess. He knew which delegates always spoke too long and which ones never spoke at all. He also knew when something was wrong. And something was wrong today. The council had labeled this session as routine. The docket was unremarkable, resource allocations, minor territorial clarifications, a dispute over transit rights through a dim star corridor that had been argued, revised, and re-argued for nearly 9 years. And then there was Item 8. Velerin had read the summary twice. Then a third time, slower. Then he had closed the file and sat with it, not because he did not understand it, but because he did. Item 8 was not complicated. It was simply misplaced. He shifted slightly in his seat, the motion slow and deliberate, more habit than necessity. The material adjusted around him with a familiarity that bordered on recognition. He had occupied this seat through 912 sessions, through 3 reorganizations of the Council's governing charter, through the admission of species that had once been considered too volatile, too primitive, too unpredictable to sit in a room like this. Now those same species argued about shipping lanes and tariff percentages. Time changed everything. Except patterns. And patterns, Velerin had learned, were the only things worth trusting. He let his gaze move across the chamber floor. Delegations arrived in clusters, as they always did, alliances forming physical proximity without needing to declare it. The Thesari grouped near the central axis, their tall, narrow forms perfectly aligned with the chamber's geometric symmetry. The Velker representatives occupied the outer arc, as far from the speaker's podium as protocol allowed without technically violating it. The hegemony delegation entered last among the major powers. They always did. Not because they were late, but because they understood timing as a form of language. Their presence shifted the room in subtle ways. Conversations softened. Movements slowed. Attention, even when not directly given, bent toward them. Velerin watched them take their seats in coordinated silence. Nothing unusual. Nothing unexpected. And yet, he returned his attention to the docket resting in front of him. Item 8. A single-line entry. No extended brief. No appended analysis. No preliminary dispute logs stretching back decades like most items that reached this chamber. Just a designation. A name. And a classification that did not match the name it was attached to. He tapped the edge of the file once, a small, almost unconscious motion. In all his years here, he had seen errors. Clerical mistakes. Misfiled reports. Incorrect classifications that were quickly corrected once noticed. This did not feel like that. Errors were messy. This was precise. He looked up again as a new delegation entered, not because they were loud, or late, or visually striking, but because no one announced them. That, more than anything, made him pay attention. They walked in without escort, without ceremonial acknowledgement, without even the quiet ripple of recognition that usually followed any delegation stepping onto the chamber floor. 3 figures. Unremarkable at first glance. Which, Velerin knew, was often the most deliberate choice of all. One carried a case, hard-edged, rectangular, old-fashioned in a way that suggested intention rather than necessity. One moved like security, eyes scanning once, quickly, efficiently, then going still in the way of someone who had already memorized everything worth seeing. And the third simply walked to their assigned seat and sat down. No hesitation. No adjustment. No glance around the chamber to measure the room or acknowledge the presence of others. Just stillness. Velerin felt something settle in the back of his mind. Not a thought. Not yet. more like a shape forming where there had previously been empty space. He lowered his gaze back to the docket. Item 8. He read the name again. Then, slowly, he looked up at the three figures now seated beneath that designation. For a moment, nothing connected. Then it did. And when it did, Velerin realized two things at the exact same time. First, this session was not routine. And second, it had been labeled that way on purpose. He leaned back slightly in his seat, the movement so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not already know him well enough to recognize it. He did not speak. He did not signal. He simply watched. Because whatever was about to happen had already begun long before anyone in this room realized it. The session began exactly on time. It always did. Precision was one of the few things every species in the chamber agreed upon. Not out of respect for each other, but out of respect for the system. The system, unlike individuals, did not forget delays. It recorded them, indexed them, used them later in ways that were rarely visible and never random. The speaker entered without ceremony. A deliberate choice. The council had long ago decided that authority should not announce itself loudly. It should simply be present. She took her position at the elevated podium, high enough that every delegate had to look slightly upward to meet her gaze. It was a small detail in the chamber's design. Subtle. Denied by anyone who noticed it. And yet, over centuries, it had shaped the tone of every discussion that took place beneath it. Velerin had always appreciated that. Not because it was fair, but because it was effective. Session 913 is now in order. Her voice carried evenly, calibrated to reach every corner of the chamber without strain or emphasis. Routine. Everything about this was routine. The first item began. A dispute over transit rights through a dim star corridor, exactly as expected. The two involved parties presented their arguments with a practiced exhaustion of species that had been disagreeing for so long that the disagreement itself had become a kind of tradition. Velerin listened. He always listened. Not because the content mattered, but because patterns revealed themselves in repetition. Who interrupted? Who deferred? Who pretended to concede while positioning for a later advantage? Today, nothing deviated. The Thesari delegate spoke for precisely the allotted time. The Velker representative objected twice, no more, no less. The speaker intervened at the exact moment the exchange threatened to exceed procedural boundaries. Order restored. Decision deferred. Next item. Resource allocation. Predictable. The chamber settled into its familiar rhythm. Voices rising and falling. Documents exchanged. Minor tensions surfacing and dissolving without consequence. If someone had entered at this moment, unaware of the docket, unaware of item 8, they would have seen nothing unusual. That was the problem. Velerin's attention drifted, not away from the proceedings, but around them. He watched the delegates instead of listening to them. The hegemony representatives sat perfectly still, their posture unchanged from the moment they had taken their seats. They were listening, but not to the current discussion. Their focus had a direction to it, subtle but unmistakable. Forward. Waiting. The Thesari, usually meticulous in their note-taking, had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed, as if part of their attention was being held in reserve. Even the minor delegations, the ones who rarely influenced outcomes and knew it, seemed quieter. Not silent. Just less invested. As though the real session had not yet begun. Velerin felt the shape in his mind sharpen slightly. He shifted his gaze, carefully, without drawing attention, toward the three unannounced figures seated beneath item 8. They had not spoken. They had not moved beyond what was strictly necessary. The one with the case had placed it on the table and rested a hand on it, not protectively, not possessively. Simply, there. The security figure remained still, their earlier scan of the room apparently sufficient. No fidgeting. No second glances. No signs of the low-level vigilance most trained personnel could never fully suppress. And the third, the one seated at the center, sat with both hands resting flat on the surface of the table. Not clasped. Not folded. Flat. Palms down. Velerin had seen that posture before. Not often. but enough to recognize it. It was not defensive. It was not aggressive. It was final. He felt a faint, unfamiliar sensation settle beneath his calm. Not fear. He had outlived fear in rooms like this. Something else. Recognition, perhaps. The third item concluded. Then the fourth. Time moved forward with mechanical certainty. The chamber lights adjusted almost imperceptibly as the session crossed its midpoint. A warmer tone, calibrated to maintain focus without inducing fatigue. Another small design choice. Another quiet manipulation. Still routine. Still controlled. Still wrong. Velarin's gaze dropped once more to the docket. Item 8 waited there. Unchanged. Unexpanded. A single line that seemed, the longer he looked at it, to occupy more space than the entire rest of the document. He had the distinct impression, not for the first time in his long tenure, that the order of items was not accidental. Position mattered. Early items shaped tone. Middle items maintained rhythm. Late items were where decisions lived. He looked up again. The speaker was already transitioning. Item 7. A minor trade discrepancy between two peripheral systems. Brief. Procedural. Already half resolved before it reached the chamber. It would not take long. Velarin felt the room shift, not visibly, not audibly, but structurally. Attention tightening. Conversations at the edges fading. Even the subtle background movements, the adjustments, the quiet exchanges, began to diminish. Everyone knew what came next, even if they did not consciously acknowledge it. He let his gaze settle, fully now, on the three figures at the delegate table. They had not changed. Not in posture. Not in expression. Not in presence. And yet, they felt different now. Or perhaps it was the room that felt different around them. Item 7 concluded exactly as expected. The speaker did not pause. She did not look down at her notes. She did not need to. Item 8. For the first time since the session began, something in her voice changed. Not in volume. Not in clarity. In weight. It was a subtle shift. The kind that could be denied if questioned. The kind that left no measurable trace. But Velarin heard it. And judging by the stillness that followed, so did everyone else. He leaned back, just slightly. The shape in his mind was no longer forming. It was there. He did not yet know what it meant. But he understood one thing with complete certainty. Whatever Item 8 was, it had never been routine. The speaker did not introduce Item 8 as a discussion. She introduced it as a reading. That, more than anything, told Velarin what this was. Not a debate. Not a negotiation. A decision, already made, now being formalized. The chamber recognized it too. The subtle ambient noise, the quiet data exchanges, the low murmurs between adjacent delegations, faded completely. Even species that communicated through non-auditory means seemed to still, as if silence itself had become procedural. The speaker glanced down briefly. Then began. Item 8. Review of non-compliant expansion activity conducted by the Sol System Civilization. No name. No title. Just classification. Velarin's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, to the three figures at the delegate table. They did not react. The speaker continued. Charges are as follows. Her tone remained even. Neutral. The kind of neutrality that did not imply fairness, only distance. Unauthorized establishment of extra-system infrastructure beyond designated development boundaries. A pause. Not for effect. For accuracy. Unlicensed interaction with sanctioned systems under restricted council oversight. Another pause. The words were precise. Each one placed carefully, leaving no room for reinterpretation. Interference with a hegemony patrol unit operating under recognized jurisdictional authority. That one landed. Velarin did not need to look toward the hegemony delegation to know they were listening closely now. The air around them had sharpened, their stillness taking on a different quality, not passive, but contained. The speaker continued without deviation. The incident in question resulted in the disablement of 3 hegemony vessels. disablement, not destruction. A deliberate choice of wording, followed by the restoration of partial operational capacity prior to departure of the soul vessel. That caused the smallest ripple. Not sound, not movement, just attention shifting. Velerin felt it pass through the chamber like a current. Repaired. Unprompted. He filed the detail away. The speaker did not acknowledge the reaction. She moved forward. No formal communication was issued by the soul vessel following the engagement. No claim was made. No justification submitted. Another pause. This one slightly longer. Not emotional. Procedural. The Council has reviewed all available data and determined that these actions constitute a breach of standing interspecies conduct protocols. There it was. The transition. Charges to judgment. Velerin already knew what came next. He had seen this structure too many times. But something about the weight in the room made him listen more carefully than usual. The ruling is as follows. No one moved. The Sol System civilization is to be placed under full-spectrum quarantine effective immediately. The words entered the chamber cleanly, without emphasis, without hesitation, and yet they landed with a density that seemed to compress the space itself. Velerin felt his attention sharpen, every detail suddenly precise. Quarantine parameters include the following. The speaker listed them one by one. Suspension of all external trade licenses. Termination of access to Council communication relays. Restriction of all Sol-registered vessels to their origin system. Prohibition of travel beyond designated stellar boundary. Each line was delivered in the same tone. Equal weight. Equal finality. No Council-affiliated species is permitted to engage in commerce, data exchange, or cooperative development with the Sol System for the duration of the quarantine. A pause. Then the duration. 50 standard years. That was excessive. Velerin did not react outwardly. He did not need to. He had heard enough rulings to understand proportionality. This was not proportional. For infractions of this scale, first-time violations, limited engagement, no escalation beyond contained conflict, the expected outcome would have been fines. Restrictions. Warnings formalized into record. Not this. This was not corrective. This was demonstrative. A message. He let his gaze move, carefully, across the chamber. No one spoke. No one objected. Which meant they had known. Or at least, they had expected something like this. The hegemony delegation remained still, but there was a subtle shift there now. Not satisfaction. Not quite. Something closer to resolution. Velerin returned his attention to the central table. To the three figures who had not moved since the reading began. The one with the case had not opened it. The security figure had not shifted position. And the central representative had been writing. On paper. Actual paper. The motion was steady. Uninterrupted. As if the words being spoken were not new information, but confirmation of something already understood. The speaker concluded. The Sol System delegation has been allotted 30 seconds for response prior to formal closure of this item. 30 seconds. For 50 years. Velerin felt that unfamiliar sensation again. Sharper now. Not surprise. Not outrage. Something colder. He watched. The representative at the center placed the writing instrument down. Carefully. Aligned it with the edge of the paper. Then gathered the pages into a single precise stack. Only then did she look up. For the first time since entering the chamber. Her gaze moved to the speaker's podium. Not searching. Not questioning. Simply meeting it. Velerin held very still. Something in the room had shifted again. Not externally. Internally. As if the outcome had already diverged from expectation, and only now was catching up to itself. The 30-second window had barely begun. She spoke before it mattered. Her voice was quiet. Not amplified. Not projected. And yet every seat in the chamber heard it. Clear. Unwavering. We accept. We'll remember you did this. 7 words. No emphasis. No visible emotion. No performance. Just record. For a fraction of a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sound. Soft. Dismissive. Laughter. From somewhere in the chamber. Then another. And another. Not loud. Not unified. But present. The kind of reaction reserved for something considered insignificant. Velerin did not laugh. He watched the representative gather her papers. Watched the other two figures rise with her. Watched them turn, not abruptly, not slowly, and begin walking toward the chamber exit. They did not look back. They did not hesitate. They moved with the exact pace of individuals who had completed the task they came to perform. Nothing more. Nothing less. Velerin's gaze followed them until the doors closed behind them. The sound of it was quiet. Final. Beside him, a junior aide leaned slightly closer. "It's done," the aide said under their breath. Velerin did not look away from the door. "Yes," he said. Then, after a brief pause, "That's what concerns me." The chamber did not erupt. It did not fracture into argument or descend into procedural chaos the way it sometimes did after controversial rulings. Instead, it continued. That was the second thing Velerin noticed. The speaker closed item 8 with the same measured tone she had used to open it. The docket advanced. Item 9 began. A shipping regulation amendment. Minor. Technical. Irrelevant. And yet it proceeded as if nothing of consequence had just occurred. Delegates resumed speaking. Documents were exchanged. Votes were cast. The system absorbed the moment and moved forward. Efficient. Uninterrupted. Velerin had always respected that about the council. Today, he found it unsettling. He let the voices wash over him without fully processing the content. His attention remained fixed somewhere else, on the space the human delegation had occupied only minutes before. Empty now. Completely unremarkable. As if they had never been there at all. That was efficient. The voice came from his right, Sorvin, his junior aide. Young. Precise. Still at the stage of experience where outcomes were evaluated based on how cleanly they were executed. Velerin did not respond immediately. He watched as two delegates at the far end of the chamber quietly exchanged remarks, subvocal, discreet, the kind of communication meant to be private but not entirely hidden. They were not discussing the ruling. They were discussing the next item. Moving on. Already. That is one way to describe it, Velerin said at last. Sorvin tilted his head slightly, a small gesture, curious but restrained. You disagree? Velerin considered the question. Not the answer. The question itself. Disagreement implied uncertainty. This was not uncertainty. This was misalignment. They did not argue, Velerin said. Sorvin blinked once. That is not unusual, he replied. Some delegations choose not to contest rulings they cannot change. Velerin nodded slowly. Yes, he said. Some do. He let a brief silence settle between them before continuing. But they usually try. Sorvin did not answer immediately. Velerin could almost see the thought forming, the comparison being made against prior cases, prior sessions, prior outcomes. They had 30 seconds, Sorvin said finally. Perhaps they chose not to waste them. Velerin turned his head slightly, just enough to look at him directly. And instead, he said, they used them perfectly. Sorvin frowned, just slightly. Not disagreement. Processing. Velerin returned his gaze to the chamber floor. He had seen this before, species facing sanctions, restrictions, even isolation. He had seen anger. He had seen desperation. He had seen carefully constructed performances of calm that fractured under pressure the moment a ruling went against them. He had seen pride collapse into pleading. He had seen calculation dressed as compliance. He had seen every variation of resistance that could be expressed within the constraints of a system designed to contain it. He had never, not once, seen someone treat a ruling like a record entry. Filed. Accepted. Stored. For later use. He felt that unfamiliar sensation again. Clearer now. Colder. Recognition, yes. But also anticipation. He leaned back slightly in his seat, the motion slow, almost imperceptible. "They did not come here to argue," he said quietly. Sorvin glanced at him. "Then why come at all?" Velerin did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted, not to the speaker, not to the active delegates, but to the upper tiers of the chamber, to the observation levels, to the empty seats that should have been occupied. Patterns. Absences. Timing. "They came to witness," he said. Sorvin's expression tightened. "Witness what?" Velerin's eyes returned to the chamber doors. Closed. Sealed. "Unremarkable. The moment," he said, "this became official." Sorvin followed his gaze, though there was nothing to see. The chamber continued its work. Item 9 concluded. Item 10 began. Votes passed. Records updated. The system moved forward, just as it always did. But something had shifted. Not in the structure. Not in the procedures. In the meaning. Velerin could feel it, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as a subtle realignment beneath everything he was watching. The ruling had not ended something. It had defined it. He lowered his gaze to the docket once more. Item 8 was now marked as complete. Closed. Finalized. Archived. He stared at the designation for a moment longer than necessary. Then, slowly, he reached out and made a small notation in his private interface. Not part of the official record. Not visible to the council. Just for himself. A habit he had developed over centuries. A way of marking moments that felt significant. He entered the date. The item number. And then, after a brief pause, a single word. Watch. He did not know exactly what he expected to see. He did not know when it would happen. But he knew this with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with experience. Nothing that quiet was ever insignificant. The session ended 3 hours later. Delegates rose. Conversations resumed. The chamber emptied in layers, as it always did. Velerin remained seated a little longer than necessary. Not out of habit. Out of consideration. He replayed the moment in his mind. Not the ruling itself, not the charges, not even the severity of the punishment. Just the response. 7 words. No emotion. No resistance. No hesitation. He had heard threats before. Thousands of them. Loud ones. Angry ones. Desperate ones. This had not been a threat. That was what made it different. It had been something else. Something quieter. Something that did not need to be believed immediately to become real later. He rose at last, his movements slow but steady. As he turned to leave, he found himself glancing once more at the chamber doors. Closed. Still. Unchanged. He studied them for a moment. Then inclined his head slightly, not in respect, not in acknowledgement, but in recognition of something he could not yet fully define. And then he left. 50 years is a long time. Long enough for stars to shift in their slow patterns. Long enough for alliances to form, fracture, and be forgotten. Long enough for a species to disappear quietly from relevance without anyone marking the exact moment it happened. The council did not count the years that way. It counted in sessions, records, amendments. Velerin counted them differently. He counted from a single entry. Item 8. Year 1 passed without incident. The quarantine went into effect precisely at the designated time, midnight, Galactic Standard. Human communication frequencies fell silent exactly as expected. Trade routes adjusted. Contracts dissolved. Supply chains restructured themselves with the efficient indifference of systems designed to survive disruption. Reports were filed. Compliance confirmed. Earth, Sol System, was contained. Velerin made his first entry. Nothing unusual. Year 3. Still nothing. The Council's language began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. Where once reports had read, "Active human trade corridor, temporarily suspended," they now read, "Former human trade corridor." Past tense. It happened gradually. No decision was made to change the phrasing. No directive issued. Language simply adapted. Velerin noticed. He wrote it down. Year 6. New species admitted to the Council. Old disputes resolved. A minor border conflict in the outer systems escalated, then de-escalated, then disappeared from primary attention within 14 sessions. The galaxy continued. It always did. Earth did not. At least, not visibly. Velerin's file remained thin, sparse. A collection of dates and observations that, taken individually, meant nothing. Taken together, still nothing. And yet he continued. Year 9. A briefing document circulated among mid-tier trade delegates. Routine. Mostly projections. Supply fluctuations. Resource redistribution. Long-term economic adjustments following the absence of human participation. Velerin read it once. Then again. There was a section, small, easily overlooked, regarding inefficiencies. Trade routes that were technically optimal on paper but consistently underperforming in practice. Transit times slightly longer than predicted. Nothing dramatic. Nothing measurable enough to trigger formal review. Just friction. Velerin made a note. Unexplained inefficiency in previously stable systems. No follow-up required. He added it anyway. Year 12. The phrase, human-adjacent infrastructure, appeared in a technical report. Not defined. Not explained. Used once. Then never again. Velerin flagged it. Searched for cross-references. Found none. He added it to the file. Year 15. A merchant vessel was detained near the quarantine boundary. Violation of protocol. Routine enforcement. The captain's statement was included in the report. Standard procedure. Velerin read it. Paused. Read it again. The captain claimed that his cargo hold had been empty when he entered the restricted zone, and full when he exited. Not with contraband he had acquired. With tools. Precision instruments. Unregistered designs. When questioned, the captain stated, repeatedly, that he had not docked, had not exchanged goods, had not encountered any vessel or installation within the restricted area. His navigation logs supported this. The report concluded. Clerical inconsistency. Possible fabrication. Fine issued. Case closed. Velerin did not close it. He requested the design schematics of the tools. They were provided. He studied them for a long time. They were repaired, replaced, maintained. Some he recognized. Most he did not. A few. He could not even determine their function. He added them to the file. Year 18. A communications relay positioned near the outer edge of the Sol quarantine zone went offline. Not unusual. Relays failed. A maintenance crew was dispatched. Velerin did not think about it again. Until the follow-up report arrived. The relay had not failed. It had been disassembled. Carefully. Completely. Every component removed. No damage. No signs of force. No trace of intrusion. In its place, attached to the relay's structural frame, was a single object. A sheet. Physical. Primitive. Paper. Velerin felt that now familiar cold sensation return as he read the description. The sheet contained writing. Not in any currently active council language. The document was forwarded to Xenolinguistics. Analysis took 3 months. The result was attached at the end of the report. Translation. Acknowledged. Velerin read the word 4 times. Then once more, slower. The Xenolinguist's note appended beneath it was brief. The phrasing is consistent with receipt confirmation in early human administrative language structures. Receipt. Acknowledged. As if something had been received. As if something had been delivered. Velerin added the report to his file. Year 22. The file had grown. Not large. Not significant. But structured. Entries arranged in sequence. Dates aligned. Events placed side by side. He reviewed it. Not for content. For pattern. At first glance. There was none. Sensor irregularities. Economic inefficiencies. Unexplained tools. A dismantled relay. A single word left behind. Each incident had been explained, individually, reasonably, contained within acceptable margins of error. The Council's official position remained unchanged. The quarantine was intact. Earth was isolated, contained. Velerin stared at the entries. Then, slowly, he rearranged them. Not physically, mentally, not as separate incidents, as a sequence. He did not reach a conclusion. He did not name what he was seeing. But for the first time, it did not look like nothing. It looked like preparation. He closed the file, sat back, and remained very still for a long time. Outside his private quarters, the galaxy moved as it always had. Trade continued. Conflicts rose and fell. Species advanced. Systems evolved. Earth remained silent, forgotten. A footnote in council briefings. An example used in orientation sessions for newly admitted civilizations. This is what happens when procedure is ignored. This is the cost of non-compliance. Velerin had heard the phrasing repeated often enough that he could anticipate it before it was spoken. He never corrected it. He never spoke about his file. He simply added to it, carefully, patiently, year by year, because nothing, when observed closely enough, had begun to look like something else. By year 25, Velerin stopped asking whether the incidents were connected. They were. The question had changed. The question was now, connected to what? He did not say this aloud. He did not write it in the file. He simply continued adding entries. Year 27. A hegemony patrol operating near the outer quarantine boundary reported sensor anomalies. 4 separate readings over 8 weeks. Each one consistent. Each one resolving to nothing when approached. No vessel. No debris. No residual energy signature. The official explanation. Calibration drift. The patrol ship was serviced. The readings stopped. Case closed. Velerin wrote it down anyway. Not the explanation. Just the pattern. Year 30. A logistics network spanning 3 mid-tier systems reported a synchronization issue. Minor. Annoying. Unprofitable. Cargo shipments were arriving, not late, not lost, but misaligned. Arriving before receiving stations had allocated processing resources. Arriving after optimal redistribution windows had passed. Perfectly functional systems behaving inefficiently. The report concluded. Network desynchronization due to outdated routing algorithms. Updates were deployed. The issue resolved. Velerin added a note. These routes had previously been optimal. 4 decades. Until year 1 of the quarantine. He did not draw a conclusion. He did not need to. Year 33. A research outpost in unclaimed space published a paper. Anonymous submission. Untraceable origin. The topic was obscure enough that it did not receive immediate attention. Advanced material stability under variable gravitational stress. Velerin would not have noticed it, except for one line, buried deep in the methodology section. A reference to a manufacturing process that did not exist in any registered industrial database. He checked. Twice. Then a third time. Nothing. The paper was verified. Replicated. Accepted. The process worked. It was added to council-approved engineering practices within 2 years. No one asked where it came from. Velerin did. Privately. He added it to the file. Year 36. A minor agricultural system on the edge of council space reported a surplus. Unexpected. Unexplained. Their production capacity had not changed. Their climate had not improved. No external aid had been recorded. And yet, yields had increased. Not dramatically, but consistently. Enough to stabilize a region that had been flagged for long-term resource deficiency. The Council classified it as localized optimization. No further investigation required. Velerin obtained soil samples through a contact. He had them analyzed. The growth pattern did not match any registered agricultural method. It did, however, resemble something. Something old. something he had seen referenced once before in a pre-quarantine archive. Early human agricultural experimentation. He added it to the file. Year 38. The file had grown to 41 entries. Velerin reviewed them again. Not individually. Together. He aligned the dates. Marked the locations. Cross-referenced the systems. A pattern emerged. Not clean. Not obvious. But there. Like a shape beneath water, distorted by distance, visible only when viewed at the right angle. The incidents were not random. They were distributed. Strategically. Across systems that shared one common trait. They had all, at some point, been dependent, directly or indirectly, on human infrastructure before the quarantine. Trade routes. Data relays. Logistics frameworks. Optimization layers that had never been formally documented because they had always simply worked. Until they didn't. Until year 1. Velerin leaned back, his gaze unfocused. He felt it fully now. The recognition that had been forming for decades. Humans had not disappeared from the system. They had been removed from the record. There was a difference. Year 40. A medical journal published a treatment for a degenerative neural condition that had been classified as incurable for nearly 2 centuries. The submission was anonymous. The relay point unregistered. The methodology elegant, efficient, impossible. Velerin read the paper in full. Then again. Then once more, slower. The treatment worked. It was tested across multiple species. Implemented within 18 months. Billions benefited. No origin. No credit. No claim. He added it to the file. Year 43. Velerin stopped trying to explain the entries individually. That was how the Council handled anomalies. Isolate. Explain. Close. He did the opposite. He connected them. And once connected, they became something else. Not errors. Not noise. Not coincidence. They became intent. Quiet. Precise. Patient. He looked at the earliest entries. Sensor ghosts. Misaligned trade routes. Unregistered tools. A dismantled relay with a single word left behind. Acknowledged. Acknowledged what? A delivery. A transfer. A boundary crossed. He did not know. But he understood something now that he had not allowed himself to fully accept before. The quarantine had not contained human activity. It had redirected it. Year 46. 11 outer systems, long flagged for chronic resource instability, reported full stabilization. Food supplies consistent. Quality improved. No new trade agreements. No registered aid. No infrastructural expansion on record. Velerin requested samples. Again. The analysis returned with the same conclusion as before. Unregistered agricultural method. Consistent across all 11 systems. He compared the data. Matched it to earlier entries. The same pattern. The same signature, if it could be called that. He closed the report slowly. His hands, steady for decades, remained steady. But something beneath that steadiness had shifted. Not fear. Not yet. Something closer to inevitability. He returned to his file. 47 years of entries. Small things. Individually meaningless. Together, they formed a structure. Incomplete. Unlabeled. But undeniably present. He did not know what the structure was. He did not know its purpose. But he knew this with absolute certainty. It had not been built accidentally. He opened a new entry. Paused. Then wrote, "This is not survival." He sat with the words for a long moment. Then added, "This is preparation." He did not elaborate. He did not speculate further. He simply saved the entry. And for the first time since he had begun the file, he considered the possibility that whatever was being built was not meant to remain unseen forever. Outside, the galaxy continued as it always had. Busy. Expanding. Confident in its own systems. Unaware that, across decades of quiet, careful work, Something had been taking shape just beyond the edges of its understanding. Something patient. Something precise. Something that had accepted and remembered. By year 48, Velerin no longer attended every session. Not because he had lost interest. Because he had learned where to look instead. The chamber still functioned as it always had, structured, precise, predictable. Decisions were made. Records updated. The machinery of governance continued its steady, uninterrupted motion. But the truth of what was happening was not in the chamber anymore. It had moved. Quietly. Gradually. Beyond the places where the Council expected to find it. Velerin spent most of his time now in his private quarters. A room lined with archived data, layered across decades of careful observation. The official records occupied one side, clean, categorized, verified. His file occupied the other. Unofficial. Unshared. Unresolved. He had stopped pretending it was incomplete. It was complete enough. Complete enough to understand. Not fully. Not in detail. But in direction. That was enough. He sat in his chair, the light from the window dimmed to a low, steady glow. Outside, the station moved through its usual cycle. Ships arriving, departing, signals crossing invisible networks that bound the galaxy together. Systems functioning. As they always had. As they still did. Because whatever had changed had not broken anything. That was the part that troubled him most. He opened the file. 48 years of entries. He did not read them in order anymore. He moved through them the way one moves through memory, jumping from moment to moment, following connections that did not exist on the surface but revealed themselves underneath. Sensor ghosts. Tools that appeared without origin. Infrastructure no one had built. Food that grew where it should not. Cures without authors. Relays dismantled and acknowledged. Each one small. Each one explainable. Each one dismissed. Together, they formed something that no longer resembled anomaly. They resembled intention. Velerin leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a moment. Not from fatigue. From clarity. It had taken him decades to reach it. Not because the information was hidden, but because the implication had been. The Council had assumed quarantine meant isolation. Isolation meant limitation. Limitation meant decline. It was a logical chain. Clean. Predictable. Wrong. Velerin opened his eyes. They removed pressure, he said quietly to the empty room. The words sounded unfamiliar spoken aloud. He had written around the idea for years without naming it. Now that he had, it felt obvious. They removed structure. He looked at the file again. At the distribution of events. At the systems affected. At the quiet precision of every intervention. They removed constraint. And in doing so, they had removed the one thing that had been limiting human behavior within the broader galactic system. Expectation. Regulation. Observation. He felt a slow, steady understanding settle into place. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Just inevitable. They gave them space. Velerin's gaze drifted toward the window. Ships moved through the docking lanes, ordered, controlled, visible, accounted for. Everything the Council understood existed within that framework. Movement that could be tracked. Growth that could be measured. Development that could be regulated. He turned back to the file. To the things that had happened outside that framework. Untracked. Unregulated. Unseen. They did not contain them, he said. They released them. The realization did not come with fear. Not immediately. It came with something quieter. Respect. The kind reserved for a pattern recognized too late to interrupt. He opened a new entry. His final entry. He did not hesitate this time. He did not soften the language. He did not qualify the statement. He wrote, "They are not recovering." A pause. Then, "They are reorganizing." Another pause. Longer. Then the final line. "I believe this is directed outward." He stopped there. Not because he had nothing more to say. because anything more would have been speculation. And Velerin had built his entire file on one principle: record only what can be observed. Everything else would reveal itself in time. He felt it differently now. Not as sessions, not as years, as limit. His body had begun to fail in small, predictable ways. Systems slowing, responses delayed. The quiet negotiation that living things eventually entered into with their own continuation. He did not resist it. He had outlived his role. The chamber no longer required him. The file might. He looked at it for a long moment, then closed it. Not locked, not hidden, simply placed where it could be found. His granddaughter would understand that. Velsera, methodical, precise, an archivist. She would not ignore something like this. She would read it carefully, completely, and she would do what he had not. Decide what it meant. Or decide not to. Either way, the file would continue. That was enough. His last days were quiet. Not empty. Not lonely. Just still. He spent them where he had spent so much of his life, observing, watching the movement outside his window, thinking about patterns, about pressure, about what happened when it was applied, and what happened when it was removed. He thought about the 7 words, not their tone, not their delivery, their function. They had not been a reaction. They had been a marker, a point in time, a line drawn, before, after. On his final morning, the light fell across the room at an angle he had not seen before. Or perhaps he had, and simply never noticed. He opened the file one last time. Read the final entry. Then, slowly, added a single line beneath it. Short. Simple. Without emphasis. This was intentional. He considered adding more. He did not. Anything else would have weakened it. He saved the file, closed it, and placed his hand over it for a brief moment, not as possession, not as farewell, but as acknowledgement. Record complete. Velerin died 11 days later. Quietly, without complication. His passing was noted in the council records. A brief entry. Respectful. Accurate. Unremarkable. His file was not mentioned. It was found 2 days after that. Velsera discovered it while sorting his personal archives. She recognized it immediately for what it was. Not because of its content, because of its structure. Her grandfather did not record things without purpose. She read it. All of it. From the first entry to the last line. She did not rush. She did not skim. She did not interpret as she read. She simply absorbed. When she finished, she sat for a long time without moving. Not confused. Not overwhelmed. Thinking. Not about whether it was correct. About what it meant. And more importantly, whether it was her place to decide. She closed the file carefully. Labeled it. Archived it properly. Not hidden. Not flagged. Placed exactly where something like this should be placed. Where it could be found by someone who knew to look. She did not report it to the council. Not because she doubted it. Because reporting it would require summarizing it. And summarizing it would require choosing an interpretation. She was not ready to do that. Not yet. Instead, she added a single notation. Small. Precise. In her own hand. Beneath his final entry. Review required. She paused. Then, after a moment, added one more line. When context becomes available. And then she closed the file. Far beyond the station. Beyond the council's mapped systems. Beyond the places where observation was expected. Something continued. Quietly. Carefully. Uninterrupted. And for the first time in nearly 50 years. It was almost ready to be seen. Decades had passed. The station, the council, even the records had assumed stability. Then came the first signal. Not from any known ship. Not from any charted system. Not even from sensors that should have detected it. It was faint. almost imperceptible. Yet it carried pattern, a rhythm, a signature unmistakable to anyone trained in human design. Velsera recognized it immediately. She did not hesitate. Ships appeared first as anomalies, blurred blips on the edge of detection grids, then as defined shapes, then whole fleets. But they were not the same humans the Council remembered. They had evolved. Not biologically, at least not in the obvious ways, but socially, cognitively, culturally. Patterns that were once predictable were now non-linear. Networks of coordination that seemed impossible until analyzed. Forms of communication and interaction that leveraged physics, psychology, and technology simultaneously. Humans had returned. But they were no longer constrained. The first encounter was subtle. Small teams landing in uninhabited zones, studying the environment, testing reaction times, observing before interacting. No aggression. No diplomacy. Just presence. The Council scrambled its response, expecting disorder, chaos, rebellion. Instead, it encountered organization. A precision so meticulous it bordered on alien. Velsera watched from the observation deck as humans moved like living algorithms. The Council had assumed control, assumed predictability, assumed that history's lessons were enough. It was not. Within weeks, the humans began reorganizing infrastructure. Not as an invasion, not as conquest, but as adaptation. Systems previously deemed complete were upgraded. Stations restructured. Communication protocols enhanced. Supply chains optimized in ways the Council had never considered. The station itself seemed to hum differently, responding to their presence as though recognizing new patterns in its operation. Velsera understood. They didn't return to reclaim, she said aloud. They returned to evolve. And then came the first human-initiated contact with other civilizations. Not with threats. Not with demands. With proposals, suggestions, insights. The galaxy's network began to shift, not chaotically, not violently, but intentionally. Every move they made reflected decades of learning from the space in between, from the absence of constraint, from freedom they had been granted long ago. The Council realized their mistake too late. Velsera watched as her people, her species, transformed the systems they had left behind. The chamber tried to respond. Protocols attempted intervention. Commands were issued. Orders dispatched. But the humans no longer operated within those boundaries. They had become something more than predictable entities. They were a force defined not by aggression, nor by structure, nor by oversight, but by adaptability, ingenuity, and collective intelligence. The station recorded every action. Sensors captured every movement. Logs expanded exponentially. Yet no one could fully understand it. Not yet. Velsera recorded her observations carefully. Every entry precise. Her grandfather's lessons echoing in her mind. Record what can be observed. Do not assume motive. Patterns will reveal themselves in time. She added her own notation. They are not conquering. They are constructing. Observe. Do not interfere. The human's return was subtle. To anyone else, it would have seemed like a slow, unremarkable colonization. To those who understood the file, Velsera, and eventually those who would come after her, it was the culmination of decades of invisible work, patience, and silent evolution. The galaxy had not been abandoned. It had been prepared. And in the quiet observation rooms, behind screens, across decades of archived data, a single truth became undeniable. The humans were no longer predictable. They were intentional. And the Council, the records, the old systems, they were merely the canvas. Velsera leaned back. She understood now what her grandfather had meant. They were never recovering, she whispered. They were becoming. And for the first time in nearly a century, humanity returned, not to survive, but to define. Velsera stared at the main observation grid, blinking rapidly as layers of information scrolled past her. Every system recalibrated. Every algorithm adjusted. Every prediction she had made, wrong. The humans were rewriting the rules. Not just of one station. Not of one system. Of everything. The council gathered in an emergency convocation. Faces pale, voices tight. Reports streamed in from border stations, outposts, and deep space observation points. Supply chains restructured before shortages occurred. Communications optimized across multiple star systems simultaneously. Conflicts resolved before escalation. Knowledge networks expanded organically, linking civilizations that had never spoken. It wasn't just efficiency. It was foresight. Velsera's voice trembled as she presented her analysis. They are operating beyond linear causality. Their actions are not random nor reactive. They anticipate outcomes, yet remain adaptable to change. Every move seems preemptively informed. A counselor scoffed. Preemptive? That's impossible. Even advanced AI cannot predict complex social behavior across multiple species. Velsera shook her head. This isn't prediction. This is evolution in motion. They are designing themselves into the galaxy. The realization hit slowly at first. Then like a shockwave. The humans were no longer just a species. They were a system. A network. A force. Every attempt at containment, every measure of control, every old protocol, obsolete. Even their most advanced technology struggled to match the humans' adaptive structures. Every interaction left the galaxy subtly altered. Every observation revealed a pattern, but not one that could be fully understood. It was living strategy. Velsera wandered the observation decks late into the artificial night, remembering the stories her grandfather had told her. They may leave, but what they build remains. And when they return, it will be not to reclaim, but to awaken. She finally understood. This was the awakening. The humans didn't just return. They redefined presence. They redefined intelligence. They redefined power, not as dominance, but as capability, adaptability, and collective purpose. And the galaxy was not prepared. Across systems, civilizations began noticing the subtle shifts. Trade networks optimized without interference. Conflicts diffused without force. Knowledge shared without borders. No one had asked for this change. No one fully understood it. Yet it was undeniable. The humans had returned, not as conquerors, not as survivors, but as architects of the future. Velsera sat quietly, writing the final entry in her observation log for the century. Understanding them is no longer the goal. Witnessing them is. The council fell silent. The humans were no longer a variable, they were the constant. And with that, the truth was clear. The galaxy would never be the same again. Stars shimmered in unusual patterns. Space itself seemed to hum. The humans were no longer confined to one system, one faction, or one civilization. They had become a living network of influence, evolution, and purpose. Velsera stood on the bridge of the central observatory, watching the ripple effects unfold. Every action the humans took, simple or monumental, cascaded through the galaxy. Star systems once isolated now pulsed with trade and knowledge. Former rivals collaborated on shared projects of unprecedented scale. Conflicts were not erased, but transformed into solutions no one had imagined. It was symbiosis. A human emissary appeared on the main hologrid. Calm, poised, but unmistakably commanding presence. Velsera, the voice said, you've observed, analyzed, and tried to contain us. Now, we offer choice, evolve with us, or witness the galaxy move forward without you. The council members froze. Every system they thought was under control now operated independently of their influence, but in harmony with the humans' guidance. Velsera felt something she hadn't in decades. Hope, mixed with awe, tempered by fear. The humans were not invaders. They were not conquerors. They were catalysts. And the galaxy itself was responding. Cities rebuilt themselves on distant planets. Ships reorganized into autonomous, self-learning fleets. Communication webs expanded like living organisms. Knowledge no longer siloed, it was a shared consciousness. Every challenge, every conflict, every mystery, transformed into opportunity. Velsera walked through a central hub on one of the newly unified systems. She watched species she had only read about exchange ideas freely. Artifacts of war were now libraries. Former enemies collaborated on exploration missions. She realized the truth. The humans didn't just return to survive. They returned to awaken. Her final report, recorded in the Galactic Archives. We were observers. We were analysts. But now, we are witnesses. The humans have become the galaxy's catalyst. Their presence is evolution itself. Resistance is irrelevant. Adaptation is necessary. The future begins with them. The bridge lights dimmed. The stars above pulsed softly. The humans moved onward, always forward, never backward, shaping civilizations, guiding growth, and leaving no system untouched. And for the first time in millennia, the galaxy understood. This was not a return. This was a transformation.